Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Literature Channel. I'm Tim Wilson. This is the first of two lectures on Sigmund Freud and psychoanalytic literary theory. It's part of our larger course on contemporary literary theory. We're into week 5 now, so let's get started. This first lecture will cover an introduction generally to psychoanalysis and psychoanalytic literary theory. We'll look in particular into Freud's breakthroughs and in particular, the Oedipal Complex, as elucidated in his important work, The Interpretation of Dreams, the Oedipal Complex outlined there, as well as the dream work and how dreams transform our unconscious desires into socially acceptable forms through condensation and displacement, among other things. So that's what we'll cover in this lecture. The next lecture will cover others theorists in the Freudian tradition. So Freud's influence through Jung and Northrop Frye, as well as Jacques Lacan and others in that tradition. So psychoanalysis as a psychological theory subverts the pillars of human agency and identity, namely our rational choices, our conscious intention, our sense of who we are. Psychoanalytic theory is a theory of interpretation. Psychoanalytic literary theory is a theory of interpretation which calls into question our common sense facts of literature and culture, revealing deeper unconscious meanings behind the surface of the text. So, according to psychoanalytic theory, the conscious self is formed when the individual realizes it must repress certain socially unacceptable desires. Consciousness is merely the epiphenomenon of unconscious forces, desires, and energies. Also, there's an important role of language in this formation process. In language, desire becomes subject to certain rules and is given a certain form. And with Jacques Lacan, the unconscious itself is structured like a language. But the energies of desire are not totally monitored by conscious awareness. Unconscious wishes are expressed by being attached to certain images. So let's look at how Freud developed these theories. He published his foundational texts of psychoanalysis, including the interpretation of dreams in that period of 1900 to 1905. And this was really this revolutionary period. He had been undertaking different psychological studies before that, but this is where he really set the field into a new direction. And it was in this period that he introduced what's often referred to as his topographic theory of the psyche. So remember, psyche comes from the Greek word. It directly comes from the Greek for soul or mind. So it's psyche in Greek has a broader connotation of soul, self, mind, that type of thing. That aspect has been narrowed in psychological thinking to consciousness and mind only. So in Freud's topographic theory of the psyche, we have three basic levels. There's our consciousness, which is our perception system, sensing and ordering external stimuli. There's pre-consciousness, the realm of images and thoughts that can be called into consciousness. So it's unconscious, but it's not been repressed. And then there's our unconscious. So all that is that through different mechanisms we try to keep from consciousness. The unconscious mind is dynamic, and this is an important point. So the unconscious mind, in their ideas and images, undergo an interplay where through associations between them, they facilitate a shift of feelings and energies and affections between one to the other. So, for example, a fear of castration can become associated with a fear of losing one's eyes. And this is really the key, as we'll see, to what Freud understands as the dream work. And then, as we'll see, the key to understanding a psychoanalytic interpretation of a text or literature, to see that this play is happening in the language of the text itself, and that what might be seen as on the surface level just a description of a tree is more than that. It might be a displaced or a condensation of other images. In 1923, Freud published The Ego and the Id, which developed a new, often called structural model of the psyche, which has three components: the id, the ego, and the superego. So the id is the instinctual drives arising out of the needs of the body. The ego arises out of the id. It regulates drives in relation to external barriers, social norms, and in relation to the superego. And the superego is the representation of parental social influence. It's kind of like our moral conscience. This model complements the older model. It doesn't replace it. And here's an attempt at a visual representation. It's often consciousness, or the mind itself is often figured as an iceberg. You know, our consciousness is really only the tip of the iceberg, and there's so much happening underneath. So in the structural model, the id wants its wishes satisfied now. The ego is threatened by the pressure of these unacceptable wishes. So memories of these wishes are charged with unpleasurable feelings, and they're barred from consciousness, and this is repression. So let's look at the interpretation of dreams, that very important work. So Freud outlines notion of repression, first of all, in this work. And in primary repression, like the first forms of repression, that's when unconsciousness itself is formed. On the individual level, the first repression of socially unacceptable drives needed to enter society, that is the first repression that forms the unconscious. And at the societal level, historically speaking, when humans first formed societies, they needed to establish certain taboos, and this becomes kind of a social repression of certain desires. So societies need to establish the absolute taboo against incest and form exogamy, so marrying outside one's group, as the basis of social exchange, leading to the Oedipal complex, etc. So before these repressions, instinctual drives are neither conscious nor unconscious. There's just instinct happening. So these repressed desires return in various forms. So one is called a parapraxis, so a Freudian slip. So there's a kind of an old joke that what's a Freudian slip? Well, that's when you mean one thing but say a mother. So that kind of Freudian slip that sometimes can happen is an example not just of an innocent slip of the tongue. It's an example of a repressed desire, according to Freud, right? That's returning through being displaced onto this other word. Now, the other forms that these can take are dreams, jokes, and art and literature. And this is the key for literary theory, is that for Freud, literature marks one of the privileged points in which repressed desires find expression in different forms. Okay. So I must say, as an editorial note at this point, that that Freudian psychoanalytic theory is the most difficult theory for me to try to teach. It has to be taught as one of these schools of theory because it's been so influential, and we'll talk about that, especially in the second lecture. Its vast influence. Probably only Marx had more influence. So we need to talk about it in this course, but it's the most difficult for me to give a fair shrift to, because I find it so far-fetched and so limiting in terms of what it can reveal about a work. So in my mind, a work is going to speak to someone on spiritual levels, ontological levels, about the nature of existence as a whole. It's going to talk about our political well-being. It's going to talk about individual well-being. Um, to narrow it down, especially in Freudian psychoanalysis, to particular physical or sexual desires as the only kind of, let's say, truth behind some sort of great work of literature seems to me to take a very narrow view on the potential human possibilities within any great literary work. But that's my aside, and I'll try to give the best sales pitch I can for this, or the best description at least of this school of literary theory. So, in again, continuing on the interpretation of dreams, the Oedipal complex forms a basis of the of Freud's point of departure, and I'll try to unpack that a bit. We'll go through his text where he describes the nature of this Oedipal complex. He bases his description of the Oedipal complex and what Oedipus means through a reference to Oedipus Rex of Sophocles. Okay, so Oedipus is a character in various ancient Greek myths, of course, and Oedipus Rex, the play by Sophocles, is an important retelling, a particular version of that myth. And we'll go through his description of that, which will A, help us understand Freud's understanding of it, but also for those of you who may not know the myth or Sophocles' retelling of it, give a brief, let's say, plot summary of that as well. So this is from the interpretation of dreams, and as you can see, a reminder, these quotes are from the Norton Anthology of Theory and Criticism, NATC, which is the course text for this contemporary literary theory course. And he says there, in my experience, which is already extensive, the chief part in the mental lives of all children who later become psychoneurotics is played by their parents. Being in love with the one parent and hating the other are among the essential constituents of the stock of psychical impulses, which is formed at that time and which is of such importance in determining the symptoms of the later neurosis. So this Oedipal complex that Freud isolates is an attachment to the other sexed parent and a hatred of the other parent because they've robbed that love object from you already. Freud goes on to say, quote, this discovery is confirmed by a legend that has come down to us from classical antiquity, a legend whose profound and universal power to move can only be understood if the hypothesis I have put forward in regard to the psychology of children has an equally universal validity. What I have in mind is the legend of King Oedipus and Sophocles' drama which bears his name. So a couple of points here. So literature is taken here as an example to prove the psychological theory. Freud's point of departure is not to say, okay, I want to develop a theory that's going to help me understand this text better. The text is taken as an example that confirms the theory. So that's one important point. And I think the other point here is that he says that this drama has a universal appeal. It's appealed to people through time and that appeal can only be explained if his theory is correct about Oedipal desires that all people have had to negotiate their way throughout their lives. I think that's another leap. We have to make a leap there because obviously Homer's Iliad is appealed throughout ages, and obviously it's a different story, and there are universal appeals there as well, it seems to me, and it's not necessarily because of infantile desires and the Oedipal complex. So as we've had occasion to note in other lectures, when we encounter a work in the past, there's probably a universal dimension. There's an element of identity, but there's going to be some elements that are strange and other. So we're going to encounter both. And Freud has had to make a leap here that when it comes to the particular dimensions of the plot of Oedipus Rex, that is what is universal, as opposed to, let us say, the confrontation with fate or the confrontation with suffering, the confrontation with questioning. So Freud goes on to describe a little bit of the plot of this legend. Quote, on the road leading away from what he believed was his home, he met King Laius and slew him in a sudden quarrel. He came next to Thebes and solved the riddle set him by the Sphinx, who barred his way. Out of gratitude, the Thebans made him their king and gave him Jocasta's hand in marriage. He reigned long in peace and honor, and she who, unknown to him, was his mother, bore him 2 sons and 2 daughters. Then at last a plague broke out, and the Thebans made inquiry once more of the oracle. It is at this point that Sophocles' tragedy opens. The messengers bring back the reply that the plague will cease when the murderer of Laius has been driven from the land. The action of the plague consists in nothing other than the process of revealing with cunning delays and ever-mounting excitement, a process that can be likened to the work of a psychoanalysis. That Oedipus himself is the murderer of Laius, but further that he is the son of the murdered man and of Jocasta. Appalled at the abomination which he has unwittingly perpetrated, Oedipus blinds himself and forsakes his home. The oracle has been fulfilled. If Oedipus Rex moves a modern audience no less than it did the contemporary Greek one, the explanation can only be that its effect does not lie in the contrast between destiny and human will, but is to be looked for in the particular nature of the material on which that contrast is exemplified. There must be something which makes a voice within us ready to recognize the compelling force of destiny in the Oedipus. His destiny moves us only because it might have been ours, because the oracle laid the same curse upon us before our birth as upon him. It is the fate of all of us, perhaps, to direct our first sexual impulses towards our mother and our first hatred and first murderous wish against our father. Our dreams convince us that this is so. King Oedipus, who slew his father Laius and married his mother Jocasta, merely shows us the fulfillment of our own childhood wishes. So, as I said, the universality of the play is not in some confrontation with the divine will, with fate, with existential questions. It's with this kind of narrowed sense of sexual wish fulfillment or that type of thing. And literature is taken as an example to support a theory of unconscious desires. And literature itself is understood as a wish fulfillment, okay, is understood as a way to express these desires in a socially acceptable way. Again, to quote from Freud, here is one in whom these primeval wishes of our childhood have been fulfilled, and we shrink back from him with the whole force of the repression by which those wishes have since that time been held down within us. While the poet, as he unravels the past, brings to light the guilt of Oedipus, he is at the same time compelling us to recognize our own inner minds, in which those same impulses, though suppressed, are still to be found. So again, for Freud, the artist is the one able to control the return of the repressed. So great art is a controlled revelation of this repressed and brought forth in a way that we can confront. He says, after his discussion of Oedipus Rex by Sophocles, he goes on to discuss briefly Shakespeare's Hamlet as another example of a treatment in a classic drama of the same Oedipal material. He says, for it can, of course, only be the poet's own mind which confronts us in Hamlet. So after he's discussed this, what he's saying is being revealed there is Shakespeare's desires revealing themselves in a different way. So for Freud, the psychoanalytic method is about us uncovering the poet's mind, let us say the expressive whole. And this, if we look at this diagram in the bottom right, a reminder, this comes from W.H. Abrams, and I find a useful tool for trying to understand the different poles upon which the literary theory can work in terms of, are we saying the object of reading a literary work is to understand it as a representation of the universe? Is it to understand how it affects the audience? That's the bottom right. Is it to understand the work as an expression of an artistic intention? This is the psychoanalytic pole. For Freud, the psychoanalytic approach to literature is to see literature as an expression of unconscious desires that the artist can tap into. And we're able to decode that just as an analyst would decode a dream. Okay. Now, later schools of psychoanalytic theory would expand that to say, well, no, we can look at a psychoanalytic approach to the work itself. So when I'm looking at Hamlet, the work, I can also psychoanalyze the character. So Hamlet himself is going through these different Oedipal infantile wishes, and we can figure out to what extent the text of Hamlet's speeches betray those wishes. Also, we can look at how the interaction of the audience with the text is a matter of the audience being able to undertake certain wish fulfillments by seeing these played out in ways that are not threatening to them. So different Freudian theorists in the Freudian tradition have done that as well. On Hamlet, for instance, this is an examples of taking the approach of looking at the characters, a psychoanalytic approach to the work itself. Ernest Jones developed Freud's passing references to Shakespeare's Hamlet into a full-fledged interpretation of the play. And interestingly, he had long conversations with Laurence Olivier about his own, Ernest Jones, theories of the Oedipal motivations behind Hamlet's actions in the play. So Laurence Olivier really took this seriously and tried to seriously understand Hamlet the play and Hamlet the character as being motivated by these Oedipal motivations. And these theories informed Olivier's 1937 staging of the play and his important film of the play of 1948. So here's a still from that film. And this film and this particular Oedipal interpretation of Hamlet has really had an outsized influence on interpretation of Hamlet. Unfortunately, I would say, because I think it's narrowed again the interpretation of Hamlet. Hamlet's a profound reflection on being and non-being, to be or not to be. It's a profound, let's say, metaphysic, ontological, spiritual reflection. It's a political reflection. There's war and rebellion going on. There's maybe a little family drama going in there as well, but especially since the early 20th century, and with that Freudian, let's say, shadow over it, people have really focused on this as a psychological drama about as Olivier says in a voiceover narration at the beginning of his film version of the play, it's a play about a person who couldn't make up his mind. So in the film, he excised the political elements. So Fortinbras and the war is completely left out in order to focus on the psychological dimension, and in order to heighten the Oedipal sexual attraction and tension between the characters, he casts Eileen Hurley, who at the time was aged 29, to play Hamlet's mother, while he played Hamlet at age 40. And then they have this passionate closet scene. So there's a closet scene in Hamlet in Act 3, Scene 4, where we have Hamlet and Gertrude. Hamlet confronts Gertrude with certain accusations, and the closet in Elizabethan England is basically a dressing room, and it's outside the bedroom per se. But this is shot in the bedroom. They have full open mouth kisses there when they resolve one another, and it really skews, as I said, this interpretation of the play. So one example of Freud's impact from the interpretation of dreams, the notion of the Oedipal complex on later scholars who are going to look at a work such as Hamlet and how that's played out in performance and other interpretive vehicles. So the interpretation of dreams focuses on dreams. He refers to these literary works, Sophocles and Shakespeare, to talk about the structure of Oedipal desires that are being repressed. But his point of departure is to work out the structures of how to interpret dreams. That's the title. And dreams are the primary means by which unconscious wishes return, because during sleep, the defense mechanisms of consciousness are loosened. And unconscious thoughts must surface in dreams, as in art, through disguised form. They must have compromised formations. So you're not going to have a dream about what you've repressed directly. It's going to come in a different form. So first of all, the thing to note will be is Freud delineates between the manifest content of a dream. So that's, let's say, the surface level, and its latent content. So to quote Freud here, we have introduced a new class of psychical material between the manifest content of dreams and the conclusions of our inquiry, namely their latent content, or as we say, the dream thoughts, arrived at by means of our procedure. It is from these dream thoughts and not from a dream's manifest content that we disentangle its meaning. So the meaning of dreams, as in the meaning of a text, is not its surface level. We have to dig deeper to its latent content, will be the meaning of the text. Its meaning will be the unconscious desires. That's the truth of the text. That's its meaning. So the dream work, there's a certain dream work that happens for unconscious desires that are too socially unacceptable to reach consciousness. They have to come through in compromised form. So a certain work has to be done on these unconscious desires, and the primary mechanisms are condensation and displacement. So condensation is combining multiple unconscious ideas or people into a single dream image. So it compresses information to bypass the mind's internal censor. And displacement, so it can shift the emotional weight from an important, shocking idea to an insignificant one. And this disguises the true intensity of a desire or fear to prevent waking up. And this is why the most important dream elements often seem very trivial or bizarre. So condensation examples might be a composite person dreaming of a stranger who has your boss's voice, your father's hair, your childhood friend's clothes, or a location that seems to be a multiple locations at once, being in a house in the dream that is simultaneously your current apartment, your high school, and a church. So in literature, we can often see this happening for a Freudian critic through metaphoric or symbolic relations between characters, actions, objects, etc. So, for instance, in Shakespeare's Macbeth, blood is condensed. It's literally the blood from a murder, but it simultaneously symbolizes guilt. It symbolizes the lineage of kingship, the disruption of nature, and Macbeth's inescapable fate. So every time the word or the image appears, all these meanings are compressed and they appear together. So displacement, and examples in dreams might be shifted anger. So feeling intense rage in a dream because you dropped a spoon masks maybe deeper anger towards a parent or something like this. A substitute animal dreaming of a terrifying and aggressive dog to represent feared authority figure. And in literature, this is often represented as metonymic relations or relations of contiguity or part whole. So metaphors are based on similarity or dissimilarity. Metonymic relations are based on contiguity or part whole relationships. So in Shakespeare's Macbeth, when Macbeth is first named Thane of Cawdor, he reacts defensively. Thane of Cawdor lives. Why do you dress me in borrowed robes? Later, as his tyranny unravels, Angus describes Macbeth's failing power using the same metonymic shift. Quote, now does he feel his title hang loose about him like a giant's robe upon a dwarfish thief. So I'll close there. That's a very brief overview of Freud's psychoanalytic theory, his interpretation of dreams. In our second lecture, we'll look at Freud's influence, namely the Jungian tradition and the Lacanian tradition, as well as a couple of other Freudians. I hope this was useful. Thank you very much.